Notifications started popping up on my phone as I was preparing dinner. The nanny, who had cared for my son since he was little, was hurriedly sending me WhatsApp messages. I opened them without thinking twice and saw the screenshots. They were conversations between him, my husband, and another woman. Intimate words, hidden promises. My heart raced and my hands trembled, but I knew I had to remain calm. I stood there, staring at the lit screen, as if this couldn't be real. For years he'd sworn fidelity, looked me in the eye, telling me I was the only one. And now, in seconds, the mask seemed to have slipped. I read and reread those messages, feeling each sentence like a knife. They weren't just typed words, they were proof. And I didn't know if I had the strength to face this alone. The sound of the automatic gate brought me back to reality. He was arriving home, calm, unaware that his lies had already been exposed. I took a deep breath, trying to mask the turmoil inside me. It wasn't time to act yet. I needed to understand how far this was going. But a certainty was already growing within me. Nothing would be the same again. In the first few days after the screenshots, I forced myself to act as if nothing had happened. I'd make breakfast, listen to his stories of tiring meetings, and respond with a restrained smile. He didn't notice that my eyes were different, attentive to every gesture. Silence was my weapon, and I used it without him suspecting. I remembered how peaceful our life had seemed months ago. Family dinners, lazy Sundays on the couch, and laughter during silly TV shows. It was hard to believe that the same man who made me feel safe was now hiding such heavy secrets. His contradiction gnawed at me. I looked at him and no longer knew who he really was. The first thing I noticed was his cell phone. Previously left on the table or counter, now it was always in my pocket, even carried to the bathroom. The ringtone vibrated, and he'd cover it up with a, "It's just work." I mentally jotted down every detail. The pieces began to fit together like a puzzle I'd never wanted to put together. At night, when we lay side by side, there was an invisible abyss between us. He'd roll over and say he was so tired. I'd stare at the ceiling, the screenshots in my mind, trying to decipher how many times that scenario had already repeated itself without me noticing. His coldness was so evident it hurt more than any words. There was also his perfume. A sweet scent, nothing like what I wore, subtly permeated his clothes. A gym shirt gave off strange fragrances, as if it had been worn somewhere other than home. When I asked, he laughed, "You're imagining things." But deep inside, the truth was already screaming. I began to remember the small changes I'd previously ignored. The long trips to the gym, the workouts that supposedly lasted hours, yet my body showed no change. The rush to leave the house when I received certain calls. Even the way he kept his wallet as if hiding receipts. With each reminder, my confidence melted. At work, he'd say he had new projects, brainstorming nights, corporate events. I believed him. After all, our life was stable, and there was no reason to be suspicious. Now, each meeting became a poorly told story. With each ignored message, a void grew inside me. It was like living in a theater, where I already knew the hidden script. I decided to observe in silence. This wasn't the time to confront, but to gather evidence. The nanny, who had sent me the screenshots, said she'd sometimes seen him arriving later than usual. She didn't want to intrude, but she worried about me. That unexpected complicity gave me the strength to not feel alone in the silent war. I started checking the Uber schedules on his phone. One night, while he was showering, his watch vibrated with the completed ride notification. I quickly opened it. The destination was an unfamiliar street, far from any office. My heart raced, and I closed it before he left. I felt I was entering dangerous territory. Even my friends began to seem complicit, even if they didn't know it. He used them as excuses. I'm going out with friends, no big deal. But there was always something strange in his voice, an exaggerated care to sound convincing. I kept quiet, smiled, and kept the pretense inside. It was no longer just suspicion, it was a growing certainty. The hardest part was dealing with the good memories. Old photos on my phone, trips that seemed perfect, declarations saved in birthday notes. All of this confused me, made me doubt for a moment. But all it took was remembering the screenshots, the intimate words, for the illusion to shatter again. There was no turning back. At the gym, he'd say he needed more intense workouts. But when I checked the clothes in his backpack, there were pieces he'd never worn. It was as if he were setting up scenarios to support his excuses. This performance churned me up inside. I was facing a skilled actor, but one who had already let slip. Saturday nights were the cruelest. There used to be hours reserved for going out together or watching movies. Now, he always showed up with commitments that seemed impossible to question. I'd sit alone on the couch, listening to the silence of the house, wondering at what point in my life I'd accepted crumbs in place of love. Even at family gatherings, he seemed distant. He spoke little, looked at his phone too much. When someone asked a simple question, like, "So, are you guys going on a trip?" he'd respond with short sentences and look away. I could tell, and the pain grew. Others might just think he was tired. I knew it was much more. Anger began to mix with coldness. I began to mentally note times, places, even small slips he'd made. I said nothing. I didn't confront him. I just accumulated evidence, waiting for the right moment. My silence wasn't weakness, it was preparation. He didn't know it yet, but every lie he told was already registered in me. Deep down, I hoped for a plausible explanation, something that would dispel my suspicions. But with each passing day, he dug himself deeper into a hole. Messages were deleted, calls were declined in front of me, and even excuses so poorly crafted they felt like insults to my intelligence. It was impossible not to see the truth. Once, a neighbor mentioned seeing him leaving his car in a hurry at an odd hour. She said it casually, without malice, but it stuck with me. He didn't realize he was being watched from more than one angle. I wasn't the only one who saw the flaws in his story. This bolstered my courage. The nanny sent me another screenshot, this time more intimate. He was saying phrases he'd never repeated to me again. Words that had once been mine, now given to someone else. It was the last straw. In that moment, I realized there was no longer room for doubt. I needed to decide whether to remain silent or reveal my knowledge. Gradually, my pain began to turn into strategy. I began to feign even more normalcy, as if I truly believed his excuses. He relaxed, believing he'd convinced me. This only made my evidence gathering easier. I became a cold observer, recording every detail without letting myself be shaken. In bed when he slept, I lay awake imagining every step. My heart pounded, but my mind was calculating. I knew his fall would be great, and I needed to be prepared to not let myself be destroyed along with it. My silence wasn't submission, it was survival. I was stronger than I imagined. One random night, he forgot to turn off the notifications on his watch. I saw names I didn't recognize, messages that flashed quickly before disappearing. The watch was his flaw, his loophole. I wrote down the details, knowing that soon I would have the missing piece of the puzzle. He believed himself too secure. The lies began to weigh heavily even in our daily interactions. A sidelong glance, a sly reply, and I knew when he was lying. My feminine instinct, honed by years of living together, recognized the signs. He might fool others, but he would never fool me completely. The time for pretense was over. My thoughts were torn between pain and justice. It wasn't just a matter of betrayal, it was the disrespect, the manipulation, the way he tried to twist reality. This was the cruelest poison, making me believe I was crazy. But now, with proof in hand, I knew the madness was never mine. The conversations with the nanny were my safe haven. She, unwittingly, became an essential part of this story. She wasn't just an employee, she was someone who saw what I couldn't. The screenshots she gave me were like flashlights in a dark tunnel. I was no longer groping blindly. I was walking toward the truth. Sunday's family dinner was the final straw. While everyone laughed and chatted, he discreetly got up to answer a call. He returned minutes later, feigning casualness. But I saw the suspicious glint in his eyes. It was the look of someone living two lives. There, I realized the mask was about to slip. I knew I could no longer run from the inevitable. Every detail, every piece of evidence, every screenshot all piled up. The truth couldn't be hidden for long. What he didn't know is that I was ready to face it, and that the pain he'd caused had already transformed into something far more powerful. The sleepless nights, the swollen eyes from crying, now gave way to a fixed, unwavering gaze. I was no longer the same woman who accepted easy excuses. With each step he took, I walked silently behind, gathering what I needed. His downfall wouldn't just be personal, It would be social. Deep down, I was already rehearsing what the confrontation would be like. Firm words, evidence on the table, and the coldness of someone who refuses to be deceived. He had no idea his game was about to end. And when that moment came, there would be no turning back. Life went on, but inside me, the countdown had already begun. I knew that each lie was another step toward the end. The clock was ticking, and he didn't realize it. And while he believed he was winning, I prepared my final move. Silence gave me power. I watched, took notes, calculated. He gave himself up more and more, confident he would never be discovered. Little did he know that the truth was already in my hands, and that soon I would have the courage to reveal everything. The game was just beginning, but I still had no idea what I would find in the next test that would appear before me. Earlier that week, he left saying he needed to take care of something quick at the office. It was late at night, and the hurried way he spoke set off my alarm. I grabbed my coat and pretended I was going to the market, but in reality I stayed in the car, waiting on the street. The clock read almost 10 p.m., and I knew it wasn't about work. I waited a few minutes until he appeared, hurriedly getting into the car. It wasn't the way to the office, but to an area I knew well. I discreetly turned on the GPS, and the destination pointed to a distant neighborhood full of small, discreet hotels. My heart hammered in my chest, but I needed to calm down. The traffic at that hour was light, and I kept a safe distance. The red lights reflected off my car's windows, as if illuminating the truth I didn't want to see. He stopped in front of a simple, almost unlit building, but with a discreet reception area. I recognized it immediately. It was a motel. I stood still, watching from the corner. I saw him get out, straighten his clothes, and enter without looking around. The scene burned my eyes. It was confirmation that my entire life was being built on lies. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, preventing myself from speeding up and making a scene. This wasn't the time. I took a deep breath and drove home in silence. On the way, my thoughts tumbled over one another. The babysitter's words echoed, "He's not who you think he is." Now everything made sense. The locked cell phone, the excuses for meetings, the different perfumes. Every detail fit together like a macabre puzzle. When I got home, the silence seemed to scream. The clock read almost midnight and I was still shaking. I sat in the dark living room, staring at the photos on the bookshelf. Every memory seemed to mock me, as if to say I was the only one who didn't notice. The pain was as physical as it was emotional. Shortly after, he walked into the house. The scent of the same unfamiliar perfume accompanied him. He smiled and said, "It took me a while, but I managed to figure it out." I just nodded, hiding my desperation behind a cold gaze. There was no need for hasty confrontations. The real battle was still brewing. That night, I couldn't sleep. I watched his every move, every sigh he took in his sleep. I knew I was beside a traitor, but I needed clarity to avoid being destroyed by the impulse. My silence had become a strategy, and coldness my new companion. The following days were a challenge of self-control. I made coffee, answered trivial questions, and at the same time his every look reminded me of the motel. He had no idea I knew. He acted normally, believing he was safe. This gave me even more of an advantage. The tables were turning. I began recording dates and times in a hidden notebook. It was like assembling a silent dossier. Every detail became ammunition. It wasn't just about how I felt, but about proving to everyone that I wasn't crazy, that my intuition was right. This was my silent revenge. One afternoon, I noticed he was more distant than usual. He was secretly checking his phone, hurriedly deleting messages. When I approached, he forced a smile and said, "It was just work." The lie was so obvious it made me want to laugh, but I held it in as if I truly believed it. The more he believed me, the more vulnerable I became. Even on short outings, the signs were there. A quick lunch with colleagues would turn into 3 hours without a response. A workout at the gym always seemed to end on streets that weren't on the way back. I just needed more proof, something indisputable, for his charade to crumble completely. It was during this time that the nanny called me in. She said she had more screenshots, more proof. She showed him messages, arranging meetings, choosing discreet places, arranging times. My body froze, but my mind was grateful. I now had more than suspicions. I had an arsenal. That night, I sat on the bed and stared at my own reflection in the mirror. My face was tired, my eyes were tearful, but there was something new: determination. I was no longer the woman deceived in silence. I was the woman who watched every lie being dismantled, ready to react. The difference was, he didn't know it yet. Over the weekend we went to a family dinner. He seemed relaxed, laughing with the others, as if nothing had happened. I, on the other hand, observed every detail. The quick glances at his phone, the rush to respond to messages. His performance was convincing to others, but to me, it was transparent. In the car ride back, the silence between us was heavy. He pretended to be tired, but I knew his mind was elsewhere. I looked at the dark road and wondered, how long would he believe he could live two lives without consequences? The day of truth was approaching, and he had no idea. The cruelest thing was the way he looked at me, as if he still had a right to my respect. But inside me, there was no longer any admiration. All that remained was the certainty that the man I loved no longer existed. What stood before me was a stranger, an actor lost in his own role. I began to carefully plan how to reveal everything. It wouldn't be with screams or tears. It would be with evidence, cold and irrefutable. He would find himself exposed, not just before me, but before everyone who believed his lie. This would be my silent victory. Each night, my heart still ached, but there was also a growing strength. I no longer saw myself as a victim, but as someone about to take control of my own life. This process was slow, painful, but necessary. And with each new detail uncovered, I grew closer to the end. The next step came when I found a receipt forgotten in his pants. It was from an expensive restaurant we'd never been to together. The date matched exactly one of the nights he said he was in a meeting. I held the paper tightly as if it were a weapon, another piece of the puzzle. I decided to keep all these details in a secret folder. Screenshots, photos, receipts, schedules, everything organized, like a dossier. It wasn't just for me. It was so no one could say it was fabricated. When the time came, there would be no room for doubt. Even so, there were still moments when my heart wavered. I remembered the years of life together, the stories shared, the promises made before God and family. But these flashes were quickly destroyed by the evidence. He chose another path, and I would not be complicit in that. The little daily lies began to sound ridiculous. It took a while because the traffic was bad, even when I knew the route was quick. I didn't answer because I was in a meeting, but the screenshots revealed a different reality. With each sentence, I saw my trust crumble further. My body reacted to the stress in unexpected ways: insomnia, lack of appetite, palpitations. But I stood firm, knowing I had to endure. It wasn't just a matter of heartbreak, it was about dignity. And I wasn't willing to give it up. Little by little, he began to let his guard down. Maybe he thought his excuses were working. Maybe he believed I lacked the courage to suspect. This only strengthened me because the more relaxed he became, the more careless he became. And each carelessness was a victory for me. Deep down, I had already accepted the reality. My marriage was over. What remained now was to decide how to close this cycle in the most accurate way. I couldn't let him come off as a victim or try to turn the tables. I needed to show my true colors. Conversations with trusted friends were a relief. They listened without judgment, simply confirming what I already knew. A woman's intuition never fails. This phrase echoed in my mind. It wasn't just a matter of suspicion. It was the certainty I carried every day. I reached the point where I could look at him and feel nothing but coldness. The love was gone, the admiration was gone. All that remained was to wait for the right moment. It was strange to realize how someone who once meant everything could become nothing. But that was exactly what had happened. One day, while he was fast asleep, I sat in the living room and flipped through all the evidence I had. It was like watching a movie starring me, but without having asked for the role. Every page, every printout, every receipt was the trail to my liberation. I knew I was nearing the climax, and it was there, in that silent dawn, that I realized the worst part was over. I no longer lived in doubt in the what if. I was certain, I had proof, I had clarity. What remained now was to decide how to transform this pain into a turning point. And what was about to emerge would not just be proof, but the final piece that would change everything forever. That Monday morning, I woke up earlier than usual. While making coffee, I heard his phone vibrate on the nightstand. The sound was repetitive, insistent, but he didn't move. I picked up the cup, walked to the bedroom, and saw the screen light up. The name that appeared wasn't his work name. It was a female name accompanied by a heart. My stomach churned, but my expression remained serene. I placed the cup on the bedside table and returned to the kitchen. I pretended nothing had happened, but something inside me had changed. The proof was becoming increasingly clear. On the way to work, he was more attentive than usual. He complimented me, asked about my routine, as if trying to balance some guilt. The gesture, which had previously made me smile, now felt false. I watched him like someone watching a stranger trying to play a role. That night, I took advantage of his long shower to rummage through the laundry basket. Among the crumpled clothes, I found a hotel receipt. The date coincided with one of the late-night meetings he claimed to have. The yellowed paper burned in my hands like a silent confession. I tucked the receipt away inside an old book on the shelf, where he would never look. It was another piece from my secret archive. Each piece of evidence was like a brick supporting my new version, the woman who wouldn't be fooled for long. I no longer cried, I analyzed. At dinner he talked about investments and projects, but his voice sounded distant. What really echoed in my mind were the saved messages, the hidden receipts, the averted glances. I responded with short sentences, feigning distraction, and he, confident, noticed nothing. Over the weekend we were invited to a get-together with friends. The wives chatted among themselves, and I noticed discreet glances when they talked about him. One of them commented, "Your husband's been really busy, huh?" The way he said it made me feel like perhaps others knew more than I did. During the party he barely took his eyes off his phone. He got up at every notification, saying he needed to take care of something urgent. I watched from afar, mentally noting each sudden departure. This was no longer just marital betrayal. It was also a social lie, maintained in front of everyone. On the way home, the silence in the car was suffocating. He turned the radio up too loud, perhaps to avoid any conversation. I stared out the window wondering, how long can someone live two lives without drowning in contradictions? The answer, I knew, would come soon. Days later, the nanny called me again. She brought new screenshots, more explicit, more intimate, phrases he'd never said to me again, now delivered to someone else. I read each word calmly, feeling not only the pain but also a strange sense of liberation. The truth was undeniable. His cell phone became the greatest evidence against him. I noticed how he slept clutching it, as if it were a safe. But even safes have flaws. One morning it vibrated insistently, and I saw a preview of the message. Today was perfect. I didn't need anything else. I began to avoid direct discussions. There was no point in burning my evidence in a hasty confrontation. I needed the right time, the moment when the impact would be irreversible. This required patience. And every time he lied to me, looking me in the eye, my coldness grew. His coworkers started talking too much. An acquaintance commented that he seemed happy and renewed lately. The comment, said without malice, felt like confirmation. He was displaying a happiness he didn't have with me. I merely listened, but inside, anger burned. Even his body betrayed it. Different perfumes, subtle lipstick marks on collars, dark circles that didn't come from late nights working. I observed every detail like someone reading an open book. He believed I was blind, but I was just waiting for the final chapter. I began practicing my own disguise. Calculated smiles, supportive phrases, displays of affection when he least expected it. All to keep him comfortable, believing he was in control. In truth, I had already turned the tables. The difference was, he didn't know it yet. The outings to take care of business became more frequent. I no longer asked questions. I simply observed the schedules, noted the patterns. He thought my silence was carelessness, when in fact it was strategy. The day I revealed everything would be the end of the act. One night, I returned early from an appointment and found his car parked 2 blocks from home. Inside, there was a woman's scarf on the passenger seat. I pretended not to see it, but I took a picture of the scene. Another piece of evidence. Another piece of evidence. My file grew. The evidence began to speak louder than any emotion. I no longer felt just pain, but a cold determination. I knew that the truth, when it came out, would not only destroy our marriage. It would destroy the image he'd built in front of everyone. Every time he hugged me, I felt the weight of the lie. There was no love in those gestures, just theater. I responded mechanically, as if I were part of the act. He didn't notice. And this confidence of his was exactly what would bring him down. At work, gossip was rampant. I heard rumors about him being seen in suspicious places, always accompanied. I never confirmed anything, but I recorded everything in my memory. The web of lies was closing in, and he had no escape. The nanny's messages were my anchor. Each screenshot was like a reminder that I wasn't crazy, that my intuition was right. It gave me strength, showed me that I wasn't alone in this maze of lies. And I knew that, in the end, it would bear witness to what I had endured. I even considered confronting him in public, in front of friends or family. But I gave up. I didn't want a spectacle. I wanted precision. My plan was silent, almost surgical. I would expose him without raising my voice. That would be far more devastating. His face began to change before my eyes. I no longer saw my husband, but a strange man, trapped in his own lies. This realization hurt, but it also strengthened me. It was the signal that I needed to put an end to this story for good. The lonely nights taught me to strengthen myself. The silence of the house was no longer just pain, but also reflection. I discovered strength I didn't know I had. I realized that, even alone, I was whole, and this certainty became my greatest weapon. The details began to pile up in excess. Suspicious messages, forgotten receipts, strange perfumes, averted glances. He could no longer maintain the charade without leaving a trace. I simply gathered everything, ready to use it at the right moment. Even faced with so much evidence, there were moments when I asked myself, why? Why would someone destroy a family for secret affairs? I never had an answer. But I realized that perhaps the answer didn't even matter. What mattered was my reaction. The last few weeks had been a silent preparation. I became colder, more calculating, more distant. He noticed, but thought it was just stress. I had no idea the real reason lay in the dossier kept on my shelf. And one of those nights, as I glanced at my cell phone vibrating on the table, I realized it wasn't just a betrayal. It was a parallel life, a world constructed outside of me. And in that instant, I knew his downfall would be far more painful than he ever imagined. What I was about to discover would not only confirm my suspicions but reveal an even deeper secret, capable of changing everything in one fell swoop. That Friday, he said he was having a company get-together. The excuse seemed convincing. After all, these weekend get-togethers were common. But something in his tone bothered me. There was no excitement, just a rush to leave. I made a mental note of the time and let him go. As he got ready, I noticed he'd chosen his best shirt, sprayed on expensive perfume, and even polished his shoes. It was an exaggerated level of care for a simple corporate event. I watched silently, disguising my attention. Deep down, I already knew this wouldn't be just another work commitment. I decided to call a friend who worked in the same field as him. I asked if she knew of any get-togethers that day. The answer came quickly and accurately. No, at least not today. My heart sank. The lie was blatant, and he hadn't even bothered to elaborate on his excuse. I waited for him to leave and, minutes later, got in the car. I drove without a specific destination, but trusting the intuition that had guided me before. I crossed avenues, checked parking lots, until I saw his car parked in front of a romantic restaurant. It was a place known for discreet encounters. I parked far away but where I could observe. It wasn't long before I saw him enter with someone. She was younger, elegant, and held his hand intimately. The scene hit me like a punch. These weren't screenshots, they weren't rumors. It was reality before my eyes. My body trembled, but I remained still. The waiter led them to a secluded table near the window. I could see the gestures, the laughter, the knowing glances. It was perfect theater for them, but for me, it was the final confirmation. What I feared was no longer just suspicion. I considered going in and confronting them right then and there. But common sense held me back. I knew I needed solid proof, not a scandal. I took out my phone, took discreet photos, and recorded the scene from different angles. Each click was a stab in the chest, but also a weapon in my hands. As I watched, I remembered the times I asked for more attention and received cold apologies. The nights when he claimed to be tired but saved the energy to smile like that with someone else. It was cruel to realize how the attention I craved was being given so easily to someone on the outside. After almost 2 hours, they left the restaurant. They walked close, almost glued together, as if they were a legitimate couple. The quick kiss before they got into the car was the scene that sealed everything. I photographed again, even with shaky hands. There was no turning back. I returned home in silence. Driving that night was like driving through a storm. The radio on didn't drown out my thoughts. The tears threatened to fall, but I resisted. I needed to save all that energy, all that anger for the right moment. When he entered the house hours later, he seemed relieved. He had on his face the perfect disguise of a man who returned from the get-together. The smell of a different perfume still permeated his clothes. I smiled slightly and asked how it was. He replied, "Everything is normal." I almost laughed. That night I couldn't close my eyes. The sound of his breathing beside me was like a taunt. Every lie told, every glance averted, every excuse, everything echoed in my mind. I no longer shared the same bed with my husband, but with a stranger. The following days were pure observation. He maintained the same pattern: hidden cell phone, strange hours, ready excuses. I kept up my facade, cooking, laughing, participating in conversations as if nothing had happened. But inside myself, I had already crossed a line. The babysitter's messages arrived again. Now, she said that he sent intimate photos to his lover. She hesitated to show me, but I insisted. And there they were. Images that shattered any remaining illusion. The betrayal wasn't just physical. It was also emotional, digital, complete. I confronted my reflection in the mirror once again. There were deep, dark circles, but also a firm look. I was no longer the deceived woman who cried alone. This was someone who carried trials, pain, and a silent strength. His fall would be proportional to the lie he built. He believed he was safe. At the table, he talked about future plans, trips, projects. I just nodded, mentally recording each promise. Little did he know that I had already decided that none of these plans would include his presence. At work, a colleague of his accidentally called me. She got her contacts mixed up and ended up saying, "Your husband was here with us last night, as usual," but I knew better. The network of lies was collapsing even without me moving. The truth came to me. I started avoiding any physical contact. Kisses became cold, hugs almost non-existent. He noticed it, but believed it was just stress. His naivety surprised me. The man who thought he was so smart didn't realize he was being watched every second. Little by little, I started to plan how to expose everything. I didn't just want a confrontation. I wanted the mask to fall irreversibly. That he felt the weight of the humiliation I endured in silence. The stage was being set, and he had no idea. One afternoon, I came home early and found an Uber receipt in the trash. The final destination was the same restaurant where I saw him days before. I took the paper with cold hands, folded it, and put it away. It was yet another proof, yet another confirmation that he didn't bother to hide. The nanny called me again. He said he had left his cell phone unlocked for a few seconds and managed to capture new messages. They were plans for a weekend trip. While he was talking to me about a business meeting, he was planning nights with someone else. I looked at the messages and didn't cry. I just felt a deep emptiness, as if a part of me had been erased. I no longer saw a future with him. He was just waiting for the moment to put all the pieces on the table and end the farce. That Saturday, he left saying he was going to the gym. I waited a few minutes and got in the car. I followed from afar without being noticed. I watched as he parked in front of a discreet hotel and entered without looking back. I photographed the scene, with the calm of someone who already knew the ending. I went home and sat on the couch holding the cell phone with the evidence. It was strange how the pain didn't hurt as much anymore. Now it was just clarity. I was no longer the doubting, betrayed woman. I was the woman who held all the cards in the game. Friends began to suspect. One of them asked me if everything was okay, if I was further away. I smiled and said yes. But inside I knew that soon they too would see the truth. His charade wouldn't last much longer. Small attitudes became even more evident. The long shower, the hastily changed clothes, the anxiety about checking messages. I wrote everything down, like someone writing a diary of lies. And each page I filled made me stronger. deep down, I had already chosen my destiny. I wouldn't stand by someone who disrespected me like that. The confrontation would be inevitable, but I wanted it to be memorable. I wanted him to never forget the day all his lies turned against him. As he slept, I watched his face. He seemed calm, innocent. But I knew that behind that expression were dirty secrets. The contrast was almost cruel. And it was at that moment that I realized that I no longer felt anything for him, just waiting for the end. I spent the night awake, reviewing each test. Photos, receipts, prints, everything organized in folders. It was my shield, my way of ensuring that I would no longer be manipulated. I had in my hands the power to turn that story around. And there, in the silence of the morning, I understood that I was ready. It no longer mattered how much he tried to deny it. The lies were recorded, unquestionable. What would come next would only be an inevitable consequence. What I was about to do would not only destroy his image in front of me, but also in front of everyone who believed in his loyalty. I woke up that Sunday determined to maintain my normal routine. I prepared breakfast as usual, with fresh bread and freshly brewed coffee. He arrived at the table with his cell phone in his hand, laughing quietly at some message. He tried to hide it, but I saw the sparkle in his eyes. It was the same glow that he didn't have when he looked at me. While he talked about meetings and work plans, I observed his gestures, the way he held his cell phone, the anxiety of always leaving it facing down. That no longer surprised me, but it confirmed what I already knew. He was always on alert so as not to be unmasked. In the early afternoon, he said he needed to leave quickly. He claimed he was going to solve a problem with the car. I shook my head and wished him good luck. Little did he know that I was already prepared. I waited 10 minutes, grabbed my bag, and followed him. I followed at a distance, keeping the car at a constant speed. I saw him turn into a narrow street and park in front of a simple building. His heart raced, but his hands were steady on the steering wheel. I watched as he got down and looked around before entering. I waited a few minutes and got out too. I walked to the corner, and from there I could see the second-story window. Lights on, curtain ajar. I saw his silhouette next to another female figure. Loud laughter broke through the glass, and at that moment I felt the floor open up. My instincts screamed to enter, but reason held my steps. I didn't need scandals, I needed proof. Took out my cell phone and discreetly recorded it, capturing every detail that my eyes registered. The shadows moving together, the intimacy evident, the signs that left no room for doubt. I went back to the car and stood there, breathing deeply. The pain was sharp, but there was also a strange sense of clarity. I was no longer a hostage to suspicion. Now I had confirmation in front of me. The disguise game was over. When he returned home in the late afternoon, he tried to support yet another lie. He said the car needed maintenance and that the mechanic would schedule another visit. I sat on the couch, pretended to believe, and just responded with, "I understand." He smiled, thinking he had convinced me. That night, while he was sleeping, I heard his cell phone vibrate. The screen lit up the room for seconds and brought up a notification. I already missed today. My body froze, but there were no tears. Just the final confirmation that I needed to act soon. I spent the next few days in automatic mode. I worked, took care of the house, fulfilled commitments, but my mind was focused on a single objective: accumulating evidence and waiting for the right time. I knew I couldn't carry this weight much longer. The nanny sent me more captures. This time, explicit conversations, full of details about past meetings and future plans. I read each line coldly. There was nothing left to save. The man who was next to me was no longer my husband. He was a character he invented to deceive. One Wednesday night, he left saying he had dinner with clients. I let him go, but this time I decided not to follow him. I allowed it to be, just to confirm the pattern. Hours later, the Uber receipt appeared in his email, synced to his computer. The destination was the same building as the previous week. I kept the digital document along with the other evidence. My folder was already full: photos, prints, receipts, recordings. It was a solid, unquestionable file, capable of dismantling any lie. Now the question was no longer if but when I would use all of this. He began to notice my distance. I tried to start a conversation, offer small gestures of affection, but there was no more space. My gaze was firm, calculated, and it made him uncomfortable. Still, I had no idea the extent of what I knew. On Saturday, during a family lunch, he seemed more nervous. He used his cell phone constantly, leaving the table several times to answer calls. My relatives began to exchange glances, noticing the strange behavior. I remained silent, watching, letting him dig his own hole. After that day, I started planning the moment of confrontation. It wouldn't be at home, in the silence of four walls. It would be in front of people who believed in his fidelity, where the masks could no longer hold. This idea gave me the strength to endure the weight. I started to analyze my own behavior. I avoided unnecessary discussions. I didn't let anger dominate me. Every word contained was a preparation for the greater impact. I was no longer a wounded woman. I was a woman in silent war. He, on the other hand, seemed increasingly relaxed. Maybe he believed that I really didn't suspect it. His smile was looser, his apologies shorter. This overconfidence was the mistake I expected, and I was ready to enjoy it. One morning, I opened the computer again. I reviewed each test, organized it by dates and times. It was like putting together a puzzle, and the final image was clear. Betrayal, disrespect, manipulation. No excuse could erase that. The days started to seem longer. Every minute with him was an exercise in patience. I looked at their hands, remembering that they held another. The perfume he wore, knowing that it had already mixed with another body. Every detail was a cruel reminder, but also fuel for my decision. An unexpected detail emerged when a friend commented about seeing him in a bar. He said he seemed too comfortable with female company. I didn't want to give more details, but that was enough. The network of lies was already beginning to spill out of the house. The following week, I noticed that he was more anxious. I checked my cell phone more frequently. I looked at my watch every moment. I watched in silence, knowing that this anxiety revealed more than he wanted to hide. The lies were beginning to take their toll. Even his children noticed his distance. They asked him why he was always on his cell phone, why he looked so tired. He responded with ready apologies, but I knew the truth could not be hidden from them for long, and that hurt even more. One night he arrived with the strong smell of a perfume that wasn't mine. I asked casually, "Did you change your fragrance?" He fumbled his answer, laughed awkwardly, and said it was a store test. I smiled slightly, but inside I noted one more point. I no longer expected him to confess. I knew I would never have the courage to admit it. The confrontation would have to come from me, at the moment I decided. This control gave me a strange sense of power, even in the midst of pain. That Sunday, while he was sleeping, I sat in the living room and organized everything into a physical folder. Every sheet, every print, every photograph. It was heavy to hold that volume, but also liberating. It was like carrying the key to end a cycle. I looked at the walls of the house and realized that they were no longer the same. The home we built was marked by lies. There was no more room for happy memories. What remained was a charged atmosphere, waiting for the truth that would soon come. And deep down, I realized that it wouldn't just be a marital confrontation. It would be a complete exhibition. He wouldn't just lose me. He would lose the trust of everyone who believed in his image. This would be the biggest consequence of your choices. As I closed the folder and put it in the drawer, I felt a chill run down my spine. It wasn't fear, it was the certainty that I was about to change my life forever. The silence was over. The moment of truth was coming, and nothing could stop it. And what would come next would not just be the fall of one man, but the collapse of the entire charade he had built over the years. That Monday, I woke up determined not to delay the inevitable any longer. The weight of carrying so much evidence was already suffocating me. As he got ready to leave, I watched his every move. It was as if I no longer looked at my husband, but at a stranger who shared the same roof. My silence was at its limit. He talked about an important meeting early in the morning, trying to sound busy. I just nodded, hiding the notebook under the tablecloth. There were dates, times, receipts. He had no idea that I had mapped out his parallel life with such precision. After he left, I sat on the couch and stared into space. My mind oscillated between pain and coldness. There were no more tears, just strategy. The phone vibrated. It was the nanny again, with new screenshots. "He is exposing himself too much," he wrote. I took a deep breath and thanked him. The messages were explicit, detailing meetings, times, and even gifts exchanged. I read each line like someone reading a report, no longer like an injured wife. It was painful but also enlightening. The more I read, the more the anger turned to determination. That afternoon he called asking if I needed anything. His voice was sweet, almost worried. It was as if he was trying to maintain the facade of a good husband. Little did he know that I had already dismantled this mask. I responded calmly, without giving any clues. He believed he was still in control. In the evening, I prepared dinner normally. I set the table, served the food, and kept a light smile. He talked about banalities, while I only thought about the folder hidden in the closet. It was strange to live like this, knowing that his every word was just part of a theater. In the shower, I looked at my reflection in the mirror. There were signs of fatigue, but also a gleam of resistance. I knew I wouldn't come out of this story destroyed. On the contrary, it would emerge stronger. This certainty sustained me, even in the heaviest moments. Over the next few days, I began to avoid small confrontations. It wasn't worth wasting energy on superficial discussions. I saved everything for the right moment. My every silence was a preparation for the impact that would come. He didn't understand this calmness, but that was what gave me the advantage. On Friday, he said he would be traveling for work. He claimed that he would have meetings in another city, a commitment that could not be postponed. I just agreed, but I already knew it was a lie. That night, as he was packing his suitcase, I saw a new shirt, clearly chosen to impress someone. I waited for him to leave, and hours later, I received another message from the nanny. He didn't travel, he's in the city. My heart sped up, but not from pain. It was confirmation that my evidence was irrefutable. He no longer worried about keeping the stories coherent. I decided to follow him discreetly. I took the car and followed. I saw when he parked in front of a hotel, got in a hurry, and didn't look back. I photographed the scene, captured every detail. With each click, I felt my strength grow. I returned home with the feeling that there was no turning back. The proofs were complete. I didn't need anything else. Just the courage to use everything at the exact moment. This thought gave me peace, even in the midst of the storm. The next day, he came back as if nothing had happened. I brought flowers, as if it were an advance apology. He placed them on the table and said, "I thought of you." I looked at the flowers and smiled, but inside it was like I was holding a loaded gun. During lunch, he talked about future projects and plans. Each sentence sounded empty because I knew I didn't include myself in those plans. I just watched, like someone waiting for the curtain to fall on a play. And that curtain would soon fall. Little by little, my patience turned into coldness. There was no longer any place for affection, only for strategy. He didn't realize it, but my every gesture was calculated. I was preparing the final scene, and when it happened, there would be no chance of backing out. A close friend commented that I looked different. He said my gaze was firmer, less haggard. I smiled discreetly. I didn't explain, but inside I knew. It was the strength of someone who no longer accepts living in a lie. I was ready. The following week, the routine continued as usual. Work, home, family commitments. But inside it was as if a countdown was underway. Every day was one step closer to his downfall. He began to notice my silence and asked if I was okay. I said yes, I was just tired. He accepted the answer without insisting. This carelessness was further proof of how blind he was, trapped in his own confidence. That Friday, I decided to save all the files on a pen drive. It was my insurance, my protection, in case he tried to deny everything. I held the small object in my hand and felt its symbolic weight. Here was the truth that would destroy his charade. While organizing the tests, I saw the difference between who I was and who I became. Before, I would have crumbled at every lie. Now, I turned them into fuel. It was painful but also freeing. At family dinner, I noticed how he kept the same mask on. He played with his nephews, told funny stories, made everyone laugh. I watched in silence, knowing that this perfect image would soon be destroyed. And he had no idea. On the way home, he tried to hug me. I left, but I didn't feel anything. It was just physical contact, empty, soulless. Inside, I had already closed the chapter. The confrontation would only be the formalization of the end. Over the next few days, I noticed that even my children noticed something. They asked why I was more serious, more silent. I would smile and say it was just work. But deep down, I knew that everything would soon be explained. Tension began to take its toll inside the house. the looks, the silences, the strange hours. Everything accumulated like a bomb about to explode, and I knew this explosion wouldn't take much longer. That Saturday, he said he was going on a quick date with friends. I left a few minutes later and followed him again. I saw when he parked in front of an unknown house, he entered smiling, without looking back. I photographed again. It was another piece for the folder. I returned home determined. Now, it wasn't just about finding out anymore. It was about taking action. I knew I was ready, that there was no more room for excuses. His fall would be definitive. At night, I sat in the living room and looked at all the evidence spread out on the table. It was like a silent courtroom, and I was the judge. No lie could resist that. No manipulation would have any force. And as he slept peacefully, I realized that the day of revelation was closer than ever. There was no turning back. The silence would end soon, and the truth would come with a vengeance. And when this truth was exposed, it would not only destroy the marriage, but the entire world of appearances that he had built in front of everyone. That morning, I woke up determined to observe every detail. He seemed in a hurry, drinking coffee standing up, while typing on his cell phone without stopping. I just looked at him like someone watching a movie whose ending they already know. The nervousness in his gestures was impossible to hide. He even struggled to get the keys. He said he would have a business lunch, but did not wear formal clothes. He chose a casual t-shirt, new jeans, and the same sweet perfume that I already knew from another story. I didn't question it, I just smiled lightly. I knew that that day something more would come to light. As soon as it came out, I called a trusted friend. I asked him to discreetly accompany me to another vigil. She was hesitant at first, but agreed when she noticed the firmness in my voice. I could no longer face everything alone. I needed someone to confirm what I saw. We followed his car from a distance, keeping a safe distance. Traffic was calm, which made our task easier. We saw him park in front of a shopping mall, but he didn't go in alone. A young woman was already waiting for him at the entrance. The two walked together, hand in hand. My friend squeezed my arm, surprised. I just nodded, keeping my breathing controlled. There was no longer shock, just realization. Seeing them both so comfortable in public was proof that he no longer bothered to hide it. His confidence bordered on arrogance. They entered a restaurant on the second floor. My friend and I discreetly went upstairs and sat at a table far away, but with a clear view. I ordered a coffee just to cover it up. From where we were, it was possible to see every gesture, every smile. He laughed loudly, holding her hand across the table as if he were in love. I observed in silence, mentally photographing every detail. I didn't need a cell phone at that moment, because that scene would be recorded forever. It was the final blow to any shred of trust. As they ate, I noticed how he leaned in to hear her every word. It was the same attention that was once mine. My friend, indignant, said quietly, "He doesn't even hide it." I just replied, "Exactly. He no longer feels the need." This made me even more certain that the confrontation was close. After almost an hour, they got up and left together. We followed them to the parking lot. There, they said goodbye with a quick kiss without any worries. I photographed the scene discreetly. The proof was in my hands, clear as daylight. In the car, my friend was silent for a few minutes. Then he said, "You are very strong. Someone else would have made a fuss by now." I smiled sideways. I replied, "I'm just waiting for the right time." And at that moment, I realized there was no going back. I returned home carrying not only pain, but also a sense of relief. I already had everything I needed. They were no longer just suspicions. They were unquestionable evidence. And this clarity gave me the strength to endure the wait until the final moment. When he arrived home hours later, he brought chocolates, as if it were any other gift. He put it on the table and said he thought of me. I thanked him, but inside it was like receiving an insult. The sweet didn't erase the bitterness of betrayal. During dinner, he would tell funny stories, invent meetings that never existed. I listened in silence, observing every expression, every lie. With each sentence, my contempt grew. It was like living with an actor who repeated memorized lines, without realizing that the audience already knew the ending. That night, I sat in bed and organized the tests again. Photos, receipts, prints, witnesses. It was a robust file, impossible to dispute. I held each page like someone holding a piece of their own dignity. I was no longer a victim, I was someone ready to act. Over the next few days, he kept repeating the same pattern. Mysterious exits, hidden messages, weak excuses. I didn't question anything. He believed his theater worked, when in fact he was just feeding my patience. I started planning how the confrontation would go. I didn't want screams or tears. I wanted coldness. I imagined the scene. Me putting all the evidence on the table, him trying to deny it, and the evidence dismantling every word. This idea calmed me, as if it were the key to my liberation. The nanny sent me one more message. This time she said he was commenting on feeling too safe. That phrase stuck in my mind. That was exactly it. He believed he would never be discovered. And it was in this excess of confidence that his greatest weakness lay. On Saturday we went to a family birthday. He smiled, hugged relatives, made jokes as always. But at several moments he walked away to look at his cell phone. I watched, pretending to be natural. The complicit glances he exchanged with the screen were clear to me. On the way back he seemed excited, humming in the car. I stared at the dark road, thinking about how untouchable he felt. Little did he know that he was about to fall from his height, and this time there would be no safety net. Over the next few days I kept my cool. It was almost like living in two worlds, that of the lie that he held and that of the truth that I carried with me. This duality strengthened me. I knew that soon the two worlds would collide. While folding clothes, I found another forgotten receipt, this time from an expensive gift bought in a jewelry store. I never received anything from that place. I held the paper and felt my stomach drop. It was another fragment of the truth that he couldn't hide. The receipt was kept with the other evidence. With each item I gathered, my conviction solidified. There were no more doubts, just certainties. He was digging his own end with every forgotten detail. That night he tried to hug me in bed. I allowed it, but my body remained rigid. He didn't notice. He believed he still had space. But inside me, the space was already gone. All that remained was formality until the confrontation. The children began to notice his absence. They asked him why he spent so much time outside. He responded with vague excuses, talking about work and commitments. But I knew that soon even they would see the truth. It hurt me, but it also gave me strength. I talked to a friend about everything. She said, "You need to protect yourself, not just emotionally but legally." Those words stuck in my mind. I knew his downfall wouldn't just be moral, it could have greater consequences. As I prepared dinner, I felt the silence between us was deafening. He spoke in banalities, I just responded in monosyllables. It was like living in different houses, even under the same roof. The distance was already irreversible. With each lie, I felt closer to the end. There was no way for him to escape. I no longer needed new proof. What I had was enough to disassemble any version. The only thing missing was the courage to act. And one of those nights, while I was putting everything away in a definitive folder, I realized that the day of revelation was approaching. The silence would end, and his fall would be public. There was no more room for pretense. And when that moment came, not only would I be ready, but everyone around would see who he really was. Without disguises, without masks, without escape. That night, I sat at the kitchen table alone, my evidence folder open in front of me. Every receipt, every print, every photo seemed to scream the truth that I already carried in my chest. It was like staring at the X-ray of a destroyed marriage in silence. He entered the house smiling, talking loudly about the chaotic traffic that had delayed him. I watched him from afar, without interrupting, just listening to the theater. Inside, he knew that his tranquility would soon be uprooted. I closed the folder slowly and took a deep breath. It was no longer just about betrayal, it was about dignity, respect, and justice. And when the first proof was exposed, there would be no way for him to hide. 'Cause what was about to happen would not just be a confrontation, but the definitive fall of everything he believed he controlled. The next morning, I woke up calmer than I had been in months. I prepared the coffee, set the table, and left the evidence folder on the chair next to me. When he entered the kitchen, the confident smile disappeared when he saw my steady gaze. I didn't need to raise my voice, I just slid the folder towards him. "It's all there," he said coldly as he leafed palely through each piece of evidence. The silence that took over the room was more painful for him than any scream of mine could be. I stood up, took a deep breath, and faced it head-on. "You destroyed much more than a marriage. You destroyed trust, family, respect." He lowered his eyes, unable to deny it. And at that moment, I realized that the decision had already been made within me. 'Cause what would come from there would not just be the end of a story of betrayal, but the beginning of a choice that would change my life forever.